Hello, everyone, and welcome into another episode of the Crowded Booth Podcast. Bryce Koon alongside Nathan King. And if you know who Nathan King is, you know we're continuing our tour around the SEC. And we stop on the plains in Auburn, where there's a lot of offseason news. But Nathan, I know you've been covering the program for quite a while now, and there's never a shortage of things to cover when it comes to the Auburn football program. But first off, how are you doing? Are you ready for SEC Media Days?
I am very ready. That's what we were talking about right before we got rolling. And just because you've now given me the floor and you can't do anything about it, I want to say congratulations to you on covering LSU now and joining the 24/7 network. You and I have been linking up for a few years on these shows, and you even did the Mercer preview with us last year. And so I just want to say congratulations on that, and welcome to the SEC side of 24/7. But yeah, we're definitely looking forward to media days, and yeah, looking forward to seeing you there.
Of course, it's going to be a ton of fun. And one note, I don't think we've talked since the Mercer game, but man, could they not have just suspended that game? I don't know if you remember the rain; it was
Terrible.
just awful. We had to sit in the radio booth. Hey, the SID department was fantastic. Brought us some more food. That was great. But other than that, man, what a week one. But we're getting ready. I don't know how many days until Auburn kicks off. I know LSU's right around that 54. They got that Sunday night kickoff, so I imagine same kind of time frame, Nathan. So we're closing in on the date. And look, you know this, I know this. I grew up in Columbus, Georgia, 30 minutes from Auburn, a lot of Auburn fans. The talk around the town and I know around this program is one of the biggest things is identity. And they've got to find, especially an offensive identity. They hired a guy that a lot of people say can give them that. What has been kind of your early returns, early things you've heard and seen from the very early start of the Hugh Freeze era in Auburn?
Yeah, like you said, you're connected around here in terms of the expectations. Like what Auburn football looks like, has looked like, what fans expect it to look like, and and you could probably tell from that Mercer game sitting in that booth that they just didn't have it last
Yeah.
year. I mean, there were some signs very early on. That following week, the next game, they were down 10-7 at halftime to San Jose State. The next week was the worst home loss to a non-conference opponent in like 20 years when they got blasted by Penn State. So I think we talked last year about this, about looking ahead to Auburn, and I had my skepticisms, as did most people. And so obviously the Brian Harsin era did not work out there. Recruiting was a big part of that, and obviously it's the lifeblood of any big program. Use whatever buzzwords you want. Recruiting is important, and Brian Harsin didn't seem to have as good of a grasp on that as he should have, on that concept, how important it was. But B, had to execute it. He's just not a very high level recruiter. Maybe we should have seen something like that coming over from Boise State. It just wasn't his, for better or for worse, I guess mostly for worse. It just really wasn't his forte. And so you're talking about early returns on Hugh Freeze. That's number one. Like, you can't even begin the conversation without noting how good they've been on the recruiting trail, both fixing up the high school class, but also the transfer portal. And covering LSU, they did a fantastic job in the portal. Auburn was top 5 the whole cycle. They were number 1 at one point. I think they finished at number 2, and now with the little tinkering here at the end, I think they finished number 4 in the country. That has been the biggest, I think, win for Hugh Freeze early in his tenure, because you looked at this roster, particularly on defense, particularly along the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. Quarterback had obviously massive struggles last year. There really wasn't a single spot on the roster that they did not identify a need and then hit it in the transfer portal. The only spot they didn't bring in a player was the secondary, and that's because the secondary is the best part of this team. Next year they're loaded. They've got 2 or 3 NFL players at defensive back, and so this has gone from a rough roster. Things were really looking gloomy when they were trying to make a coaching hire, and it was either it kind of came down to Lane Kiffin or Hugh Freeze, and I thought they could have done well with both. I think, but you'd see a lot of positives with both. Obviously, things were a little rough around the edges in terms of presenting Hugh Freeze as an option to all Auburn fans. I think that's not a hot take to say anything like that. I mean, obviously there's a little bit of a prickly past for him, but what is going to? I remember at his introductory press conference, he said, just give me a chance. That's all he said. He said, I understand why you guys feel, why people feel this way, and I've been dealing with this for a while. All that I ask is you give me a chance. And really, I hesitate to say there has not been, I don't want to call it a home run hire or anything like that. He hasn't even played a game. Not been a bunch of negatives. I mean, they've recruited really well, done well in the transfer portal. They've retained roster talent really well. You look at the guys they've lost in the portal, didn't lose that many important players. The assistant staff has done really well. Just good vibes all around, which is what you want going into year one of a new coaching staff. And so for me at this point, I don't see any reason to say that, yeah, Hugh Freeze wasn't a good hire. I think he was a good hire. I think he's going to do well for the future of this program. And it starts in, like we're going to talk about on this show, it starts in year one where I think their schedule's not too bad and they fixed up the roster pretty well. And so this was a team this time last year, I was like, man, there are so many deficiencies. There's a lot of problems, to where now I'm thinking, yeah, this team could definitely get back to a bowl game and maybe win a couple more games than that.
You mentioned this, and I want to hit on this really quickly. And I know it was talked about on radio shows, podcasts like this, and more. But you mentioned his opening comments. How much of the just being open that he has, and watching some of these podcasts, watching some of the interviews he's done, and just how candid, even talking with you all about this, how much has that kind of helped maybe ease out, maybe smooth out some of that prickly past that you were mentioning? How has he done that, and you think he's handled that pretty well so far on the Plains?
I do, yeah. I mean, that beginning, there was a point where I was like, man, this is going to be really rough because it felt like 50-50. Maybe the majority wasn't that big, but people make themselves heard on social media. And so everything about Hugh Freeze that we would post or write about, all that kind of stuff, it was met with just these venomous comment sections of people either defending him or going after him. And I'm like, man, this is going to be a tiring coaching tenure to cover. Going through this college athletics, that all dies down after a while. And that his early approach to things, I think, was really important. John Cohen has come around. He was under fire a little bit at the beginning because he didn't take questions at the press conference. That was obviously, that's a big no-no when you're an AD and you make a hire like this. But he's come around and has really been open and transparent about this kind of stuff. But the biggest thing about Hugh Freeze, from a media perspective, he reminds all of us here a lot of Bruce Pearl, in the sense that he just knows what he should and shouldn't do in terms of not only with media, because that's what we deal with, but it's not the most important thing. The fan base overall, like talking about the possibility of hiring a Lane Kiffin. Lane Kiffin's a great coach. I think he would have done really well at Auburn. But you wonder if, the word culture fit is a bit cliched sometimes, but you wonder if a guy like Hugh Freeze, who has no problem going to these alumni events and getting in front of fans and really just kind of playing it up, but it's not disingenuous. Like, he does enjoy that stuff, and so does Bruce Pearl. Really kind of enjoying that kind of role as a head coach. Something Brian Harsin really steered away from. I love Gus Malzahn to death, but he was kind of awkward in those scenarios, just because he's the kind of guy that he is, and so that's kind of how Freeze reminds me a little bit of Pearl in that sense. And so, while that doesn't translate to on-field stuff at all, that doesn't have anything to do with what you do on the field. Get the boosters, behind you, get the fan base rallying behind you. And again, I do think that, not to sit here and, sunshine pump about a head coach and, somebody, again, who had a lot of stuff to overcome in terms of his past, but it's tough to find something that hasn't been positive so far, really, since he's arrived, both on the field and off the field. Everything has been pretty high marks so far. And for a fan base that was pretty dejected because of the Brian Harsin era, that's really what they needed. And so now you go from Cadillac Williams at the end of last year, really brought the energy back to the program, transitioning into Hugh Freeze. It's been a fun past 8 months for Auburn fans without even really playing a game.
You talked about the portal, a lot of conversation about that for Auburn and the ability to really bring in what's the equivalent of a new offense. So many different options. Wanted to ask you this because I think this is really key. Your fan base understands this, the folks that you are writing to and all these different things, podcasting to. It's a unique culture. It's a unique job in the sense of where I think that you have to be able to understand the expectations. And Nathan, I'll say this. Maybe because I grew up in Columbus, maybe because I went to multiple Auburn games, I've seen what they've done over the past decade and winning games they probably shouldn't, especially inside that home stadium. I'm a little bit higher on Auburn than I think people are around the country in the sense of just knowing what Freeze could bring. And I think it starts with the quarterback position. Wanted to get your thoughts on Peyton Thorne. Obviously, Robbie Ashford, a fantastic athlete. But is it true to the sense where Ashford is really comfortable in being developed under Freeze and understands that Thorne might be, and I don't know if you guys have seen this as well, is Thorne going to be that de facto number one guy heading into that first game?
It's difficult for me right now to say otherwise, But you don't want to take anything away from what Robbie Ashford can do in
Mhm.
terms of competing here. This is not only somebody that beat out, TJ Finley was not necessarily Tom Brady there at that starting quarterback position for them last year. But Robbie was a young guy, came over, transferred from Oregon, and TJ was an experienced guy, had experience in the offense, won the job, and then Robbie ended up being the better player over the course of the season. Also, credit where credit is due, and kind of giving proper context. Robbie Ashford played with every injury you could pretty much note from head to toe. I mean, he
Yeah.
had about 8 or 9 different injuries at the end of last year. Because from watching him, is just a guy who puts his body on the line. And so
Mhm.
you can never, ever count out a player like that. And he is a really fun player. I'm interested to see, like you said, what happens if Thorne is the starter? What does he do in terms of development? Does he stay at Auburn? Does he want to, be a dual threat quarter? What ends up happening there? Because there's just so much, I think, untapped potential for him. But all that is to say that yes, at the moment, it's difficult to say Peyton Thorne's not going to be the starting quarterback, just on experience alone. So 26 career starts at the Power 5 level, 49 career touchdown passes. That's 7 times the amount that Robbie Ashford has in his career. So again, the experience just kind of stacks up
Mhm.
there. That 2021 season for Michigan State was obviously a great year. They won 11 games. That was when they had Kenneth Walker at running back. He was fantastic that year. He broke
Yeah.
Kirk Cousins' single season touchdown record at Michigan State. Last year, again, I talked to his offensive line coach last week, and he was telling me start looking at about week 6 or 7, because that was when he got over an early season injury. You look at his numbers when he was healthy, really, really good. And so
Mm.
when he's been healthy, when he's been healthy, and B, when he's had a decent running game, he's been top 40, top 35 quarterback in the country in terms of QBR over the last couple years. You mentioned the transfer portal. Offensive line looks pretty good for Auburn. Looks like it'll
Mhm.
be better than it has been. It's been a very inconsistent for them. And if Jarquez Hunter and Brian Battie, who comes over from USF, if they can make up the loss of Tank Bigsby, you're probably talking about a pretty good running game too. And so, all of that combined with how well he fits in Hugh Freeze's system, I think Hugh Freeze's acumen with transfer quarterbacks in the past, Bo Wallace, Chad Kelly, Malik Willis, all of those guys came in and did really well under Hugh Freeze. And I should mention Philip Montgomery as well, kind of a quarterback whisperer in his own right, the offensive coordinator. He's done really well with some QBs in the past. Think Case Keenum, think Robert Griffin
Mhm.
III. And so there's a lot there, I think, that you can go off of that, like you said, that can make the argument for, hey, Auburn might be a little bit better than people think this year. Bringing those expectations down, or at least playing devil's advocate, is the fact that this offense has just been so inconsistent over
Yeah.
the past few
Yeah.
years. They did a ton of work in the portal at receiver, but they're still just transfers. They got to go out there and prove it. They don't have a number 1 guy coming back at receiver. They got a bunch of number 3s and number 4s, but do they have an alpha male at receiver? Running back, Tank Bigsby was really, really good. And I think people are
Mhm.
going to maybe realize this season, maybe Jarquez Hunter won't be as good as him, because Tank Bigsby was absolutely fantastic. And I think people are going to kind of realize what they were seeing the past couple years. But yeah, it's difficult at this point to say that Peyton Thorne doesn't win the job. But I wouldn't be surprised. I'm interested to ask you Freeze about it next week at media days. Is he comfortable with playing quarterbacks early in the year? But week 2 they go to Cal, and that's a game they could definitely lose. That's definitely a tough road game, and so they got to figure it out quickly. So I'll be interested to see what their plan is in fall camp, and if they're willing to do that early in the season.
One more question about the offense. It's a group that ranked 11th in scoring in the SEC last year. You mentioned kind of this, in what I've seen, a revolving door kind of at that wide receiver, nobody really being able to step up in that number 1 spot. And you mentioned, look, they brought in some talented guys, but the results have to come with that potential. Who's a guy, or maybe 1 or 2, that you're looking at and saying, hey, if they're going to have success in the passing game and they're going to, increase their scoring offense, it's going to have to come down to 1 or 2 guys. Do you have 2 guys in that wide receiver room that you're saying, hey, these guys got to lead the way?
2 guys that I have a difficult time not seeing producing really well this season. That Shane Hooks comes over from Jackson State, former Ole Miss commit in the portal, decommitted, and then came to Auburn. And then Camden Brown, who was a true freshman last year, he actually caught a touchdown against LSU last
Mhm.
year, really flashed when he was able to get on the field. Didn't get targeted much, didn't get on the field. But when he was able to get on there, he's a former 3-star recruit who at the end of his recruitment, Georgia and Florida State were pushing for him and saying, we want you to get in the class. And so anytime that happens, you think you're a pretty decent player. And then with Shane Hooks, really love his skill set. He was Jackson State's leading receiver last year for Deion Sanders, 10 touchdowns, 6'4". He can pretty much do everything. Philip Montgomery told me that he has 11 inch hands. He wears a 4XL glove, The NFL Combine record for hands is 11.75 apparently.
Wow.
And so Phil Montgomery was telling me the first time he shook his hand, like Shane Hooks' entire hand went like all the way to his wrist. And so yeah, I've been at the facility a little bit this summer with recruiting stuff, and like some of his teammates were telling me like Hooks is just a little bit of a different guy, a little bit of a different breed. You see him across the field, he's just like away from everybody, just doing push-ups in the corner. So I kind of, and I love that out of a receiver. I love a receiver who's a little bit unhinged. I think that's the perfect personality trait. Anyway, all that is to say that both of those guys, their skill sets, Hooks, I think, can do a little bit of everything. I think his versatility is going to allow him to play a lot of different spots. And then they've missed since Seth Williams was here, which obviously he was a really good outside receiver. But since he's been gone, they've missed an outside threat. They've missed a red zone guy. Camden Brown, 6'3", 210 pounds, really emerged as a big leader in spring ball. They've got a first-year position coach. Marcus Davis was telling us all through the spring how big of a leader he is as only a true sophomore. And then kind of an honorable mention, Rivaldo Fairweather is not a receiver, but he is a dual threat tight end, kind of a hybrid tight end receiver type role. Comes over from FIU. He was a first-team all-conference selection there last season. He's another guy. You look at him in the spring, and he was really, really doing some stuff for the offense. Hugh Freeze called him the most consistent member of the passing game. Quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end, anybody that's involved in the passing game. He said throughout the spring he was the most consistent player. So that obviously signals probably your starting tight end. Going to get a lot of options in the red zone for him. I just think this red zone offense, I don't have their numbers pulled up, but it's been bad the past 2 or 3 years. Now you've got, and I'm not even mentioning Nick Mardner, who comes over from Cincinnati. He's the tallest receiver in program history, 6'6". So you've got all this length that I've mentioned. I think they're going to be a little bit better, plus an accurate quarterback in Peyton Thorne. I think they're going to be a little bit better in the red zone this year. But those are my two guys, Hooks and Camden Brown. I really think both of them are going to have pretty decent seasons this year.
Well, it's an offense, Nathan, that if they're going to get clicking, and if it does take some time with all these new faces, they're going to have to rely on a defense that, Nathan, look, there's no secret about it. I mean, Auburn has been a team that traditionally has been able to have a really stout defense. Last season left a lot to be desired in that category. Was it more a question of just depth, or is just the overall talent level not there? And why do you think it could be better, or is it not going to be better in 2023?
Yeah, it was the worst run defense for them since 2012. Obviously, that's the season Auburn went 3-9, and we kept referencing that in stories all last year, and that's when you knew things were going to go downhill. When you keep writing since 2012, yeah, it's probably not going to go very good. Jeff Schmedding, the defensive coordinator. Look, you look at, like you said, kind of an underrated quality of Auburn for the better part of honestly the last decade. They've had a really good defense. Talking about Kevin Steele was there for 5 years. They never finished outside the top 20 in SP plus defense under Kevin Steele. Derek Mason comes over in 2021. He's a good defensive coordinator. They were pretty good that year as well. Things really fell off a cliff though last year. It never really worked under Jeff Schmedding, who was obviously Harson's DC at Boise State as well. It was the most 40-point games given up in program history. So on that mark, it was one of the worst defensive seasons ever at Auburn. But you look across the roster, and there was talent. I mean, there was talent in the secondary. You had Owen Papo at linebacker, Derek Hall and Colby Wooden at defensive line. So I hesitate to say it was much of a lack of talent as much as it was A, scheme, B, rotation. That was very confusing for us. They'd play 3 defensive linemen pretty much the entire game. And I'm not a football coach, but to me that seemed like that wasn't the best recipe for success. That's something that's really going to change. Talking to Jeremy Garrett, their new D-line coach, that's obviously a big emphasis for them. Ron Roberts comes over from Baylor, their defensive coordinator. Obviously, they had a great defense in 2021 when they won the Big 12 that year, but one of the best defenses in the country. And so the front seven, though, that is where I, again, kind of have a little bit of a question mark this year for the team. Is they bring linebackers a lot like receiver. They have names, but they're just transfers. The guys on the roster, they're not number 1 linebackers. They're number 3s and number 4s. And so how good can that group be replacing Owen Papo? The defensive line, kind of the same deal. I like Marcus Harris. He's a 3-year starter. Justin Rogers is just a people leader that comes over from Kentucky. Other than them, again, just kind of some names that you kind of throw in there and hope that somebody is going to step up from that group. That's where there's a little bit of concern for me because of how bad this run defense was last year. And so, you talking about why the defense was so bad, teams were just able to start running the ball. By the second quarter, didn't need to pass it that much. They were just establishing a consistent identity. The Georgia game comes to mind, Penn State, Arkansas. These are teams that had $150 by the second quarter on the ground. And so You really don't have to do anything fancy from there. You're pretty much wearing down the opponent at the line of scrimmage. And so that's all. It's all going to lean on the secondary in a big way, because we just talked about the front seven needing some work. We talked about it at the beginning here. The secondary is loaded. 2 or 3 NFL caliber defensive backs. DJ James and Nehemiah Pritchett were both invited to the Senior Bowl. They both could have been drafted. Maybe Nehemiah Pritchett would have been undrafted, but DJ James was like 4th, 5th round grade. Jalen Simpson has now moved back to safety. He was a really, really good looking player at the end of last year. And then there's like 3 or 4 veteran senior DBs that I'm not even mentioning. And so that's the strength of the defense. They have to be good defending the pass if they're going to hope to have any hope of improving as a defense this year, because I do think they're going to have some struggles in the front seven until they're able to rebuild that defensive line through the recruiting trail a little bit.
Are there any young names to kind of watch in this defense, especially up on the front seven, that maybe you're excited to see how they develop?
Yeah, one in particular, their top-rated signee in the class is Keldrick Falk. He flipped from Florida State. That was a big, talking about what they did on the recruiting trail. You may not look at their 24 class. I think it's number 46 right now or something like that. But you got to build guys up during the summer. But looking at what they did at the end of 23, they flipped Keldrick Falk from Florida State. They flipped Kyan Lee, who's a 4-star defensive back, flip him from Ohio State. And then they flip Connor Liu, who was spectacular at center, as an offensive lineman. They flip him from Miami. And so making those flips at the end of the 23 cycle was really big to kind of get them back on track. But no, Keldrick Falk is, everything is advertised. Just a monster, 6'5", 275. And that's what he was listed at 24/7. And then he went to the Under Armour into Army All-American game. And they measured him like there, obviously making sure everything was correct. And he checked in at like 6'5", 279. So everyone was like, oh, okay, like it's legit. Comes to Auburn, second week of spring practice. His teammates are buzzing about him, saying this guy's the truth. You don't want to put that much pressure on a true freshman, of course, but at the same time, they will be very well served if he's their best edge rusher by the end of the year. Because we talked about at the beginning, they lost Derek Hall, they lost Eku Leota. Those are their 2 best pass rushers. Colby Wooden could also rush the passer. He's gone as well. And so they have no returning production at their jack linebacker spot at that pass rusher position. And so they brought in Jalen McLeod from App State. He's kind of a 3rd down specialist, but I think as an every down guy, Keldrick Falk is going to need to be that player for them. And then I just talked about him, but Kyan Lee, this is, I say it's a loaded secondary, and it is, but it's very loaded at safety, very loaded at nickel. At corner, there's 4 really good players, but past them, there's not really anybody, which 4 is all you need if you don't have injuries. But backing up DJ James and Nehemiah Pritchett, on one side, you're going to have JD Rim, who's a former 4-star top 150 recruit. I believe he was an LSU guy, target at one point. And then on the other side, you're going to have Kyan Lee, who's a true freshman, another spectacular player in spring practice. Every time we went out there, you're looking at him and JD Rim was injured in the spring. So he got every opportunity as the number 3 corner. Every time we got to look at him, is like, that is not a freshman. That is not a freshman in college. Looks like an NFL defensive back. And so those are 2 guys I've definitely got my eye on there. And then another kind of honorable mention I'll give just real quick, a redshirt freshman guy who didn't play much at all last year was their top signee in their 22 class. And that's Robert Woodyard, former Alabama flip at linebacker. We talked about those question marks at linebacker. He was injured most last year. He dealt with a season-ending knee injury when he was a senior in high school. Kind of, those lingering effects were still there when he was a true freshman, only played on kickoffs, really. What does he look like fully healthy? Former top 150 guy, really athletic player, sort of that KJ Britt mold of just go downhill and smack somebody at the middle linebacker spot. Maybe he's somebody who could make some noise there on the second level of the defense.
Well, a lot of new names, a lot of names to know for sure, and Nathan's got that. Auburn opens up with UMass at Cal, Samford before then obviously starting SEC play. So we're doing this with every single team, and it might put you on the spot, but hey, that's okay. We can obviously edit this. It's not live. But I got 3 for you here. I've got one game that you are just most excited to watch, maybe a benchmark game to kind of see where this Auburn program is in year 1 under Hugh Freeze. Then the next one, I've got what's a trap game on this schedule. And then the third one is what's a must-win game for Auburn in 2023 if they want to get to bowl eligibility.
Yeah, those are all really good. I think I've got an SEC answer for each of those. Because if you look at the schedule, it goes really light non-conference, at least compared to what they've seen recently. I mean, teams across the country are playing much bigger non-conference opponents than Cal, and Cal is better. I think they have a top 20 transfer class. That won't be an easy game in week 2. but it's easier than going to Penn State. It's easier than some other teams that other SEC programs are playing. So you got light non-conference. You got the heavy hitters at the top in the three rivals, LSU, Alabama, and Georgia. Auburn will be big underdogs in those games. But what will decide this season is the in-betweeners. It's that kind of middle of the pack SEC West. Arkansas, Ole Miss. Is Texas A&M going to be better? Auburn needs to snag a couple of those, and they'll win 6 or 7 games. And that's based on where they were last year. That's 2 thumbs up for Hugh Freeze. That's not where Auburn wants to be in the long term, but in terms of a year-over-year rebuild, that's 2 wins of improvement if you win 7 games. And so you talk about most anticipated. Obviously, I could pick a rivalry here. That home game against Ole Miss. There's a lot of different factors going on there. You have Hugh Freeze facing his former team at Ole Miss. I think the players will be plenty charged up for that one. There's a little bit of a revenge factor because they lost in Oxford last year. That snapped a 6-game winning streak for Auburn, and that was a really good game too. That was a completely dysfunctional Auburn team, but they almost, I hesitate to say almost won, but they were very competitive against a good Ole Miss team. And then you have the Lane Kiffin saga, and whether the reasoning is proper or not, like I think a lot of it might just be drummed up by the fans, but they'll boo him. It'll be, that coaching saga left a bad taste in their mouths, even though I don't think it should have. Like they just didn't hire the guy. Like it's not necessarily a big deal, but I think he got the big extension at Ole Miss. People were saying, "Oh, you spurned Auburn." I think that should be a really big environment. It's big for Auburn that's at home, and so obviously it'd be easy to pick one of the rivalry games. That's one that I think is a little bit off the wall for them, but could be big. Also, they could be winless in the SEC going into that game, because before that, if I'm remembering correctly, you got A&M, you got LSU, and you've got Georgia. I think those are their only 3 SEC games before that. You're going to be an underdog in all those. And I know A&M might not be great, but you got to go on the road. So you could be winless. That could be a pressure situation. You come home and that home crowd can kind of let that out for you. Trap game, Vandy is, I don't know. I know maybe that Auburn and Vanderbilt, that should never be a question, but I mean,
Clarkley does a good job with them.
Last year. Yeah, and I look at that Vanderbilt roster, and they've got a lot of options. AJ Swan did a lot of good things for them at quarterback. He has his top 3 receivers back and 3 starting offensive linemen back, and so they've got a lot to replace at running back, because obviously Ray Davis went to Kentucky. Have some pieces to replace on defense like Anthony Orji, but I don't know. That's just it's a weird game. Vandy's never going to be one that you're going to feel great about if you've got to go in the road environment. I will say Nashville is Auburn's 3rd biggest alumni club, so like half the stadium might be Auburn fans, but still, it's sort of, to me, it may not be competitive, but from this far out, it's sort of screams trap game to me, because every other road game on this schedule, I don't think. Cal is tricky. I don't think that's trap. I think it's pretty cut and dry why that's tricky. A&M, you'll be an underdog. Arkansas, you'll be an underdog. Ole Miss at home, you might be an underdog. And so, it's tough to call any of those trap games. And then talking about must wins, I say Mississippi State at home. For obviously unfortunate circumstances there. That's going to be a team kind of going through a bit of a rebuild, especially on offense. And with what Will Rogers has done to you the past couple of years, because he has torched Auburn, 10 touchdown passes over the last 2 years against Auburn, including 6 and 415 yards in 2021. And so you've got to get one back against him this season. Looking at what they're looking like, I know they're losing a lot of production on both sides of the ball, and it's a home game. Again, talking about the pressure situation, you're looking at that game saying you might only have one SEC win at that point too, or 0 if things don't go your way. And so, that's one I think you've got to have at home. If you lose a game like that at home, honestly, if you lose at Vanderbilt too, those are games that if you're looking at Auburn's schedule and saying they got to get back to a bowl game, those are kind of the gimmies right now. You're saying Auburn will be favored there. You kind of got to have those if you're going to try to get back to a bowl game. Because I look at the 4 non-cons, Vandy, Ole Miss, Vandy, Mississippi State. That's 6 games. Yeah, you're kind of already at this stage of the offseason. You're kind of putting those in your bag, and then saying, all right, what other ones can they jump up and get to 7 wins? Can they jump up and get Ole Miss? Can they beat Arkansas on the road? Can they will Texas A&M be bad again? Could they win in a home Iron Bowl? I mean, shoot, they almost did it 2 years ago with a bad coach and a one-legged TJ Finley. They almost beat the Heisman winner. That happens at Jordan-Hare, stuff like that. And so you've got to have games like Vandy and Mississippi State, but I think Mississippi State is more of a must-win because it's a home game.
It could be a house of horrors for road teams, that's for sure. Nathan, last question before we get out of here, and this is more tailored towards the SEC schedule reveal. And I wanted to ask this because, and we're going to get you on our Go 24/7 podcast. I'm a little sad to not see Auburn and LSU matching up in 2024. I will say, as a person who grew up obviously in the Auburn area, that game is always fun. I've never had a dog in the fight in that game, but I have always enjoyed the passion, the kind of rivalry. LSU fans weren't too bothered by it, so on our boards. But how did the Auburn fan base react to that 2024 schedule reveal?
Yeah, I mean they were a little bummed. I think the kind of Georgia fatigue has not set in when it comes to LSU. Like, you have a faction in the fan base that's like, oh, maybe they're going to take Georgia off the schedule. Okay, like, sure, the team that might three-peat. Like, yeah, I mean, they obviously it's a historic rivalry. Nobody really wants that, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of fans were sad. It reminds them of the last time the SEC expanded. Auburn was an annual rival with Florida and Tennessee. Yeah. That was the old Amen corner. Was included Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. And so, it kind of reminds them of that, saying, it's obviously it's a historic rival that's going away at least for 1 year, but it's good to know that it'll be back. I assume it'll be back the next year, probably for 2 years in a row. At that point, you're talking about that game is just appointment television every single year.
Oh yeah.
You can point to even the matchups that on paper don't look like they were much of anything. When I was in school 4 straight years, it was 16 where they had the touchdown pass at the end that was wiped off the board. Auburn wins at home. 17, Auburn blows a huge lead on the road, and they have the DJ Chark punt return. 18, Auburn blows a huge lead at home, and then 19, they almost beat Joe Burrow when Bo Nix had a terrible game, but they almost go into Baton Rouge and win. And so, every game in that series had something. But in terms of Auburn's 24 schedule overall, it's actually not bad. No. You're getting Oklahoma and Jordan Hare. That's nice.
And you don't know what Brent Venables in Oklahoma is going to be. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. Like, should they be good? Yeah, like they should start recruiting better. But I don't know, man. I think last year was their least win since like 1997 or something like that. So like, I mean, they've got a bit of an uphill climb. As I'm looking at it right now, you got to go at Alabama, at Georgia, but Arkansas at home, A&M at home, Vandy at home, at Kentucky, at Missouri. When you're talking about Auburn, you're talking about the last 7 or 8 years of, like, you look at ESPN strength of schedule. It's like number 2, number 3, number 5, number 1. I mean, like they have murderous schedules. This one will probably be up there, but it seems pretty balanced. Like you obviously Georgia and Bama on the road. That's whatever. But as you're looking at the 12-team playoff, which I'm not saying Hugh Freeze is going to make the playoff in year 2, but Auburn, much like LSU, kind of, to me, because they play in the SEC. Well, they're not talking about the SEC West anymore. But since they play in the SEC and they kind of punch toward those 10 wins in terms of their expectation, those are a couple teams that it's like they are probably going to try to be in the hunt every year for the 12-team playoff, and they might be, because you can probably go 9-3 in the SEC and have a really good shot to make it into a 12-team playoff. And you look at the schedule for Auburn in 24, 9-3, you lose to Georgia, you lose to Alabama. Let's say, I don't know, somebody else, Arkansas, Texas A&M, Oklahoma, somebody like that. And then you win the rest of your games. I think you've got a pretty good shot to have a good season. And so I think Auburn fans, sad about LSU, of course, but otherwise, I mean, it's a pretty balanced schedule for them next year.
Yeah, I think the SEC did a pretty good job as well as they could with that schedule to balance it out. Nathan King, all things Auburn with 24/7 Sports, Auburn Undercover. Nathan, before we get out of here, let people know where they can see your work, where they can find you on social media, and as we get ramped up, where they're going to find all that great Auburn content from SEC Media Days.
Yeah, for sure. You can find me on Threads. I'm just kidding. I'm not gonna do it. AuburnUndercover.com. You'll get all of our stuff. Obviously, yeah, we're really looking forward to Media Days. And then on Twitter, because I refuse to believe it will die ever, Nathan King 24/7.
Absolutely love it. Almost shouted out the Threads. We haven't had that in the podcast yet. You almost became the first.
You'll have to let me know when someone genuinely is like, yeah, man, go to Threads. Because like you can't even, people post their threads on Twitter, but then you open it doesn't even let you go to their account.
It doesn't go to the app. It's
Zuckerberg.
It's another podcast for another day. Nathan, pumped to see you next week, man. It's going to be a lot of fun, and obviously we're going to have to reconvene when LSU and Auburn match up. I imagine you're going to be making the trip down to Baton Rouge for that matchup.
Yeah, going to stay in New Orleans, I think, with a friend. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Awesome. Never a dull time. Well, that's Nathan King. My name is Bryce Koon. This has been the Auburn Football Preview 2023. We're going to continue on the road. We're going to Ole Miss tomorrow, continuing throughout the SEC West, the last year of divisions. We'll catch you next time here on the Crowded Booth